The smell of Cascade Regional Medical Center at 6 in the morning is antiseptic and old coffee and something underneath both of those things that nobody names. The particular flatness of recycled air that has moved through too many crises to hold anything fresh. The fluorescent lights along the trauma corridor have been on since 1987. They don't flicker, they press. And on a Tuesday in March, 9 months into her float rotation, Harper Vale had learned to move through that press the way water moves through a narrow pipe, without complaint, without resistance, without leaving a mark. She had been at Cascade long enough to know which supply cart had the squeaky left wheel, which attending physician took his coffee without asking anyone to make it, and which trauma bay crash cart had a defibrillator pad slightly misaligned in its housing, a detail she had mentioned twice in writing and once in person to the charge nurse, who had nodded in the way people nod when they are already thinking about something else. 9 months. Float nurses don't put down roots. They fill gaps, absorb schedules nobody wants, and go home to apartments that look like they belong to someone in the middle of arriving rather than someone who has already stayed. Harper's apartment held no photographs. If you're reading this and you've ever worked a double shift in a place where no one knows your name well enough to say it wrong, you'll understand exactly why. She was in Trauma Bay 3 at 6:47 a.m. when the paramedic radio crackled from the intake desk. 2-minute ETA. Male, early 40s military veteran, found collapsed at the Cascade Valley Veterans Transition Office 4 blocks east, vitals fluctuating. The paramedics had flagged 2 healed gunshot entry scars on the upper left torso, not the presenting issue, they said, just notation. The presenting issue was unclear, that was the word they used, unclear. Doctor. Elliot Marsh heard the radio from the hallway. He was 61 years old and had run the emergency department at Cascade Regional for 16 consecutive years, and in those 16 years he had not once left the trauma bay uncertain about what he was looking at. He walked with the deliberate tempo of a man who had learned that speed and authority were not the same thing and had chosen the latter. His certitude was not cruelty, it was architecture. He had built this department inside of it. Harper was still organizing the bay when the gurney came through the bay doors at 6049. The man on it had the specific stillness of someone whose body was choosing very carefully between options. Sergeant Cole Decker. Age 43. 2 old scars healed clean and pale on the upper left chest. He was conscious, barely. His left hand was moving. Harper noticed it in the first 4 seconds. The tremor in his left hand was cycling, not randomly, not in the rolling spasm of a generalized seizure, but in the pattern. 3 repetitions, pause, 2, pause, 1. 3, 2, 1. It was too organized, and there was something else. The scar along his neck, old, faded from something sutured field style rather than in a surgical suite, was inflamed at its upper edge, not infected, inflamed. The kind of localized inflammatory response that suggests a deeper structure has been agitated. She clocked the intercom tone that chirped from the overhead system as the gurney rolled in, and she watched Decker's pupils. They contracted, a fraction, bilaterally, not in response to light, in response to sound. She said it quietly. The tremor is patterned, not seizure activity. The neck scar is inflamed at the proximal end. His pupils responded to the intercom tone. Marsh was already moving to the head of the bed. "Float nurse," he said without turning around. "We've got this. I want to flag a possible embedded fragment. You want to flag." He said it the way you say it when what you mean is, "Stop talking. Float nurses don't diagnose. Thank you." She held her ground for 2 more seconds. His pupils responded to sound, not light. Marsh turned. He was not angry yet, that would come. He was simply removing an obstacle from his field of vision. "Get out," he said, in front of the attending physician, in front of the 2 trauma nurses, in front of the paramedic who was still completing his handoff. "Out of this bay, please, and stay out until you're assigned." There is a specific quality to being publicly dismissed in a room full of people who know they will not defend you. It is not the dismissal that marks you. It is the way the air around you reorganizes, the way each person finds something just past your face to look at, and you understand that you are standing in a space that has already closed around your exit. Harper walked out of Trauma Bay 3 with saline still on her left glove and a pair of procedural scissors in her right hand that she hadn't put down because she'd been moving too quickly to remember to. And she stood in the corridor outside the bay and looked at the scissors for a moment and then placed them on the nearest tray cart and breathed. She was still standing there at 7004 when the first black vehicle pulled into the ambulance bay. She registered it through the bay window at the far end of the corridor, a dark SUV, government plates, no agency markings. The kind of vehicle that is not trying to be inconspicuous because it has never needed to be. Then a second one, parking beside it without the careful spacing of someone unfamiliar with the space. They had been here before, or they had memorized the layout. Both. The automatic doors at the ambulance entrance opened at 7006. The team that came through them moved with the unhurried precision of people who had already done the dangerous part of the morning. 4 personnel in tactical gear. Not military BDUs, not law enforcement vests, something in between. The kind of quiet, operational uniform that belongs to a category of work that doesn't have a civilian label. They spread into the lobby in a pattern that looked casual and wasn't. No one ran. Nobody announced anything. The staff physician at the check-in desk stood up. He was a third-year resident named Dr. Goctor. Callum Vance, 29 years old, and he had the specific posture of someone prepared to invoke protocol because protocol is the only weapon available. "This is a restricted clinical area," he said. "I'm going to need to see identification and—" The lead operator walked past him without slowing, not through aggression, through the specific irrelevance of a locked door to someone carrying the key. She was a woman in her late 30s, dark jacket over her tactical vest, no rank visible, the kind of physical carriage that comes from 10,000 hours of moving through rooms that did not want her. She turned to the unit secretary at the central desk. "Harper Vale," she said. "One question. No preamble." The secretary blinked. I think she was just in Trauma 3, she was. Where is she now?" Not a question anymore. The secretary pointed toward the corridor. The operator turned and walked it in 8 steps, and Harper heard her own name before she saw her. Heard it, the way you hear a sound you have been half expecting for a very long time without knowing it. She turned. The woman who stopped in front of her was Commander Dara Voss. Harper knew her face the way you know a face that has been present at some of the worst hours of your life, not warmly, not with relief, with the particular recognition of a shared accounting that has never been settled. Voss looked at her for 2 seconds. Then she said one word, Meridian. It was a call sign. Not a name, not a title, not a rank. A call sign from a program that had been classified for a decade, buried under a psychological withdrawal notation in a service record that had been quietly rendered invisible. It was the word for a version of Harper Vale that this hospital had never seen, had never been told existed, and had no frame to hold. Harper didn't move. She felt the word land somewhere in her chest where she'd kept a particular weight for 10 years, and she kept her face the same. The unit secretary was staring. The resident, Callum Vance, had followed the team down the corridor and was standing 6 feet back, his clipboard at his side, his protocol evaporating. 2 nurses at the far end of the hall had stopped moving. Nobody said anything. Through the trauma bay glass, Marsh could see all of it. He was standing at Decker's bedside, and his hands had paused over the chart, and he was watching his department reorganize itself around a float nurse standing in a corridor with saline on one glove. "He's decompensating," Voss said. Not loudly, exactly as loud as necessary. The activation trigger was the imaging scanner he visited this morning. The fragment in his chest wall was manufactured to respond to a specific ultrasonic frequency embedded in the scan protocol. His body has been reacting for 2 hours. If you don't go back in that room right now, the pattern tremor you identified becomes a cascade event in his thoracic muscle group and he arrests. Harper said, "How long?" "Maybe 8 minutes." She was already moving. She went through the trauma bay doors without asking. Marsh was still at the bedside. He turned when she entered, and his face carried the specific expression of a man preparing to enforce a decision he has already made. And then something in what he was seeing slowed him. Not her face, her posture, the way she moved to the bed with the exact economy of motion that belongs to someone who has been in more critical spaces than this one and has learned to spin nothing that isn't necessary. "The tremor pattern is a neuromuscular response to a remote activation signal," she said. "There's a foreign body in his chest wall, left side, between the 4th and 5th intercostal. It's been there for years. It was triggered this morning by an ultrasonic frequency in his imaging scan." The inflammatory response at the neck scar is secondary tissue reaction. The fragment has a distributing element that runs up through the fascial plane. He needs the fragment removed before the cascade locks the left thoracic muscles into sustained contraction. If that happens, he loses respiratory compensation. Marsh didn't say anything. "I've removed one before," she said. "Once, 10 years ago. I know exactly what it looks like, and I know exactly where to go." There was a pause of 3 seconds in which Elliot Marsh, 16-year chief of emergency medicine, stood in his own department and chose in full view of his staff and the tactical team now positioned outside his bay window. Keep his mouth closed and stepped slightly to the left. It was not surrender. It was something harder, the act of a man who has been certain for a very long time, allowing himself to not be in the moment when not being certain is the only thing that can help. Dr. Nadia Osei, the trauma attending who had been standing at the back of the bay since 6:49 a.m., who had watched Harper get dismissed and had not spoken and had been living inside that silence ever since, moved to the instrument tray without being asked. She had her gloves on before Harper reached the ultrasound. She did not say anything either. She just positioned herself where she would need to be and prepared. What happened over the next 40 minutes in that room will likely never appear in any hospital report that a general audience can read. The fragment was where Harper said it would be. The approach was specific and slow, not because Harper was uncertain, but because the distributing element she described ran within 3 millimeters of the subclavian vein, and the tolerance for air was surgical in a room that was technically equipped for emergency management, not open chest work. Marsh watched every move. He did not leave. He pulled the light himself twice, adjusting the angle when he could see what she needed without being told. Decker arrested the first time at the 18-minute mark. The crash cart was across the room, and Harper was mid-procedure, and Osei ran the resuscitation while Harper kept one hand on the fragment and did not move from position, talking Osei through 2 interventions simultaneously in the flat. Informational voice of someone who has coordinated crisis management in spaces with far fewer resources than this one. Decker came back. He arrested a second time at the 31-minute mark. And this time, Harper was close enough to the fragment to feel the tissue tremor, felt it through her fingertips the way you feel a current through a wire, and she did something that none of the monitors captured. She leaned toward Decker's ear. She said a name she had carried for 10 years like a stone in a coat pocket, weighty and close and private. The name of a man she had lost in a field hospital with borrowed instruments and no power, who had been the reason she had learned to find fragments in the dark, because she had not been fast enough to find his. He would have been furious, she said, not loudly, not theatrically, just a fact stated clearly in the direction of a man who needed a reason to stay. He would have told you to quit being difficult, so quit being difficult. The monitors resolved at 32 minutes and 14 seconds. Decker's heart came back. Osei closed. Harper stepped back from the bed and stripped her gloves and stood for a moment at the basin, running water over her hands, and did not say anything, and nobody in the room said anything either. And the fluorescent lights pressed down on all of them with equal indifference. Voss was waiting in the supply corridor when Harper came out. She had a sealed folder in one hand. "You should know why he was here," she said. She told her about Rowan Fitch, the federal contractor liaison who had arrived 40 minutes earlier with a jurisdiction claim and a sealed directive, documents asserting that any surgical report Harper produced, any fragment description, any chain of custody notation, fell under a classification tier that superseded civilian hospital protocol. The contractor whose technology she had identified in that field hospital 10 years ago, the same company, the same mechanism slightly refined, had spent the years since Harper's service separation making sure that her surgical report, the one that named the fragment and the manufacturing origin and the activation protocol, had been filed under psychological withdrawal and rendered inaccessible. The same company had funded the hospital's new Veterans Imaging Wing. The imaging scanner that had triggered Decker's collapse that morning was not a malfunction. It was a test, delayed activation, controlled environment, documented response time. Decker's collapse was a data point. He had been targeted specifically because someone had tracked his search for Harper, because he had been looking for her for 3 years, asking by the only name he knew. asking at veterans' offices and service organizations and through channels that someone with the right access had been monitoring. He had found her by collapsing 4 blocks from where she worked. Voss handed her the folder. Inside were files transmitted by a biomedical engineer named Maya Shen before she went dark and entered federal protection. 300 exposed personnel, the grant documentation, the signature on the suppression order, the imaging protocol specification, including the frequency range and activation sequence. Harper looked at the folder for a long time. Then she looked at the ceramic specimen cup on the tray outside the supply room, sealed and labeled in her handwriting, and thought about chain of custody. A classified directive can freeze a digital record. It can reclassify a database entry. It can reach backward into a service record and replace a surgical report with a psychiatric notation. It cannot, as a matter of physical law, reach into a sealed ceramic cup that has never left the hand of the nurse who removed its contents from a living body inside a civilian hospital. The chain of custody had begun when she picked up the scalpel, and it had not broken, and no directive had been in the room when she did it. She took the cup off the tray and put it in her scrub pocket. The hearing was 6 weeks later. Harper arrived in her scrubs. She carried Decker's chart, Osei's surgical notes, and the fragment in its sealed cup in a small paper bag, the kind you get from a hospital pharmacy. The committee member who read her introduction into the record glanced up when he finished, glanced up with the specific expression of a man who had been told a name and formed an expectation and was now reconciling both against the person in front of him. A registered nurse from Cascade Regional Medical Center. Harper leaned toward the microphone. She looked at the committee member who was still recalibrating. She said, "That's correct." She placed the paper bag on the table. She began to speak. She was not angry. She was not performing composure over anger. She was simply the person who had been in that field hospital 10 years ago, and in that trauma bay 6 weeks ago, and in every double shift in between. And she had brought the evidence with her in the only form that couldn't be touched. And she was going to describe it with the same flat precision she used when she described a tremor pattern to a physician who told her, "Float nurses don't diagnose." Outside the hearing room in the corridor where the families had gathered, spouses, parents, siblings of the 300, Elliot Marsh was standing by himself near a window. He had not been called to testify. He had come because there was someone he needed to find before the day was over. A woman whose husband he had dismissed 4 months ago, a veteran with a complaint Marsh had categorized as anxiety adjacent and resolved with a referral that led nowhere, and he had found her name in the case files Voss had made available to the hospital. And he had looked for her face in the corridor because there was no good way to begin this conversation from behind a camera or a prepared statement. He found her by the vending machine near the east stairwell. He said her name. She looked at him with the full weight of a person who has had a very long time to decide what a specific face means to her. He did not apologize into the air. He asked if her husband would be willing to come back in. He said the words carefully and without self-protection, the way a man says something when he is not trying to manage the response. The woman looked at him for a long time. Then she said she'd ask him. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was the opening of a door that had been sealed, the smallest possible movement, offered carefully by the person who had the right to offer nothing. The Meridian program opened at Cascade Regional 40 days later in the former contractor's wing, which had been stripped to its studs and rebuilt. The imaging suite funded by the contractor's grant was dark. The equipment that had been tied to that relationship had been removed pending federal review. What replaced it was smaller and less photogenic and entirely functional. On the wall beside the intake desk, in clean black text on white, one line, the patient's name before their diagnosis. Harper did not wear a uniform on the day it opened. She had no military title to display. She had no buried reports to wave. She had a patient in room 2 who had been waiting through the administrative delays of the morning, and she had his chart in her hand, and she was walking toward him when she passed the waiting area. Cole Decker was there. He had walked in on his own. He was sitting in one of the standard-issue waiting room chairs with a paper cup of coffee in both hands watching the door, and when a young man in civilian clothes came in alone, mid-20s. The particular scan-the-room look of someone who has been told many times by many different systems that what he is experiencing is probably something he is manufacturing. Decker set down his coffee. He stood. He crossed the waiting room without hurry and sat down beside the young man. He didn't say much. He asked one question. He listened to the answer. He stayed. Harper saw it from the hallway. The low morning light from the east windows caught the dust in the air above the waiting room chairs, and Decker's shoulder was angled toward the young man. And the young man had stopped scanning the room and was looking at his own hands. She kept walking. She had a patient in room 2 who had been waiting long enough. If this story stayed with you and you know someone who has been dismissed in a room that should have listened, share it, not as a viral moment, as a reminder of what it costs to be right in a place that needs you to stay quiet. And if you want more stories about the people who carry the weight without announcing it, stay close. There are more of them than you think.